14 German fighters closing fast, a formation of bombers leaking fuel and flame, and one pilot who ignored every regulation in the book and told his crew to brace themselves. He was about to attempt something no one in the European sky had ever dared. They thought he had lost his mind. 5 minutes later, they were still breathing, and the Luftwaffe had a brand new nightmare to report. The winter of 1943 sank its teeth into every airman stationed in England. Ice crusted the windows. Frost clung to oxygen masks. Below, Britain's patchwork fields vanished under December fog, and above, the contrails of 1,000 bombers carved white scars into the grey lid of war. This was the peak of the combined bomber offensive. The 8th Air Force had doubled down on daylight precision strikes, a doctrine built on American confidence and the belief that the Norden bomb site could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet in theory. Waves of B-17 flying fortresses would roll across occupied Europe, demolish Germany's war machine, and come home shielded by their own concentrated firepower to in reality. It was butchery. German fighters crashed into the bomber streams with cold efficiency. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s climbed high, lined up head-on, and plunged toward the formations at combined speeds over 500 miles per hour. The head-on attack became the trademark move of the Luftwaffe's day fighter units. It was deadly, precise, and psychologically shattering. The bombers had almost no forward-facing guns. Their nose turret held twin .50 calibers, but the gunners had only second to track, lead, and fire before the enemy ripped past or straight through the formation. Most B-17s fell without ever landing a solid shot on their attackers. The gunners knew it, the pilots knew it, and the Germans knew it. By December, losses on some raids topped 20%. Entire squadrons vanished over the Ruhr Valley or the switching yards at Schweinfurt. Crews flew their tours with grim endurance, tallying missions like prison days, fully aware the odds leaned toward death. Into this storm stepped thousands of young men who had never faced combat. Iowa farmhands, Detroit mechanics, college dropouts, factory workers, volunteers and draftees thrust into a war that demanded they strap into aluminum shells and fly through clouds of gunfire. They learned formation flying, oxygen discipline, and how to fire a gun through numb fingers. But no one taught them how to beat the head-on charge. There was no instruction book for that, only fatal acceptance and blind luck. The 8th Air Force tried everything, tied to boxes, staggered heights, escorts when possible. But in late 1943, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings barely reached the German frontier before turning back. The bombers crossed the heart of the Reich alone, and the Luftwaffe waited. The sound of it all was overwhelming and unreal. The thunder of Wright Cyclone engines at cruise. The metallic clatter of turrets spinning on bearings. Radio calls crackling as crews shouted out enemy positions. Then the howl of diving fighters. The ripping burst of 20mm cannon tearing through aluminum. The sickening thump of rounds hitting bodies. And sometimes a dreadful silence after an engine quit or wing snapped and the bomber began its slow, spiraling fall toward the earth. Into this furnace flew First Lieutenant James Howard on his 23rd combat mission. If this history hits you, tap like and subscribe. James Howard did not look like a man about to rewrite fighter combat. He was calm, deliberate, analytical, a thinker, more than a talker. Born in Canton, China in 1913 to missionary parents, he spent his early years surrounded by shifting languages, unfamiliar cultures, and the steady pulse of uncertainty. His father ran a medical mission. His mother taught school. Howard grew up watching people solve crises with limited tools and absolutely no safety net. He eventually returned to the United States for college, enrolled at Pomona, and studied pre-med. But aviation pulled harder than anatomy. In 1937, he left school and entered the Navy as an aviation cadet. He washed out, not because he lacked talent, but because a minor medical issue grounded him. It could have ended his flying dream. For most people, it would have. Howard went to China. He joined the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, in 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor. Under Claire Chennault, he flew Curtiss P-40 Warhawks against Japanese bombers and fighters over Burma and southern China. The average fought outnumbered, outgunned, and completely cut off. They had no spare parts, no replacements, and no margin for mistakes. Survival meant ingenuity, aggression, and thinking 3 steps ahead. Howard excelled that he learned to use a P-40's advantages, its diving speed, its toughness, its ability to take damage and keep flying. He learned to lure enemy fighters into traps, to use sun and cloud as cover, and to never, ever fight by the rules. In 6 months, he scored 6 confirmed victories and became one of the AVG's most dependable pilots. When the Flying Tigers disbanded in mid-1942, Howard returned to the United States and joined the Army Air Forces. He expected a Pacific assignment. Instead, he was sent to the 8-day force and stationed in England as a fighter pilot with the 354 Fighter Squadron of the newly created 355th Fighter Group. They flew P-51 Mustangs, sleek, long-range fighters that would eventually become the iconic escorts of the war. But in late 1943, the Mustang force was still tiny. The bomber offensive was reaching full intensity, and losses kept climbing. Howard was older than most fighter pilots. At 30, he was a veteran among 22-year-olds. He didn't drink hard or chase danger. He pored over mission debriefs. He asked questions. He thought in patterns, how the enemy approached, how formations broke, where the openings appeared. His squadron respected him, but didn't quite figure him out. He was steady, focused, and strangely fearless in a way that felt less like daring and more like mathematics. He flew like a man running calculations in real time. On January 11, 1944, Howard was tasked with escorting a bomber formation headed for German industrial sites near Cherselben, deep in central Germany. It was a maximum-range operation. The fighters would barely have enough fuel to reach the bombers, cover them for a few crucial minutes, and dash back to England before running dry. Howard launched into the freezing morning, assembled with his flight, and climbed toward the bomber stream. He had no way of knowing that in less than an hour he would be alone over Germany, facing a decision no tactical manual had ever imagined. The mission began to unravel 20 minutes from the target. Clouds thickened over the North Sea. Visibility collapsed. Radio discipline broke down as pilots struggled to stay in sight of one another. The bomber stream elongated, lost its structure, and became exposed. Then the German fighters appeared. They came in groups of 4 and 6, rising through the haze and positioning themselves in front of the bombers. The Luftwaffe had polished interception into a deadly choreography. Fighters climbed above and ahead, rolled inverted, and dove straight in, through the formation nose first. The closing speed gave the gunners almost no time to react, and the way to fire, cannon and machine gun rounds converging on a single bomber, was often devastating. The P-51 escorts jumped in. Dogfights broke open across the sky. Pilots left formation to chase attackers or shield bombers taking hits. Within minutes, the clean geometry of the escort plan dissolved into pure chaos. Howard's flight was dragged into a running fight with a group of Focke-Wulf 190s. He fired, maneuvered, and tried to keep himself between the Germans and the bombers, but the arithmetic was against him. Too many enemy fighters, too few Mustangs. Fuel was already becoming critical. Every minute of combat consumed precious gallons they didn't have. Then Howard glanced upward and saw them, a formation of B-17s, maybe 30 strong, drifting west and cut off from the mainstream. They were alone, no escorts anywhere near, and below them, climbing in a slow coil, were at least a dozen German fighters getting ready to strike. Howard checked his fuel. He checked his position. He tried to call his flight on the radio. Static. He swept the sky for any P-51s. Nothing. The bombers had minutes, possibly less, before the first attack run. If Howard turned back, he had a chance of reaching England. If he dived in alone, he would be outnumbered more than 10 to 1. And even if he survived the first clash, the Luftwaffe would swarm him the second they realized he was the only defender. There was no doctrine for this, no training scenario, just a cool, simple equation: abandon them or fight. Howard pushed the throttle forward and dropped toward the bombers. The German fighters hadn't committed yet. They were still arranging themselves, coordinating, setting up their approach. Howard knew he held one advantage: surprise. No one expected a single Mustang to challenge an entire staffel. He closed the gap fast. The B-17s grew large in his windscreen. He could see the bowl turret turning, the waist gunners tracking, the formation tightening on instinct as they sensed danger below. Then the first German element broke off and dived. Howard rolled sharply, took the lead angle, and fired. His tracers cut a line through the sky and clipped the wing of a Messerschmitt. The fighter broke away trailing smoke, and the others scattered. Confusion spread through the German formation. One escort should have been an easy kill, but Howard wasn't flying like an escort. He flew like a man with nothing to lose and a flawless grasp of geometry. The Luftwaffe regrouped. They attacked again and again, head-on passes, beam assaults, slicing dives from above. Howard met each one with fire and precise movement. He didn't try to turn fight. He didn't chase. He stayed welded to the bombers and made himself the obstacle every German pilot had to remove before they could reach their targets. And then he did something no one imagined. He flew into the middle of the bomber formation. Fighter doctrine in 1943 was unambiguous. Escorts stayed outside the bomber group. They guarded the flanks, the high cover, the approach routes. They intercepted threats before they reached the heavies. Close escort was seen as defensive, passive, and inefficient. No one flew inside the formation. The danger was too great. The bombers held tight spacing, wingtip to wingtip, leaving almost no room. Prop wash and slipstream turbulence formed invisible traps of violent air. A fighter caught in the wake could lose control, collide, or get blasted by friendly gunners. Bomber crews were trained to shoot at anything fast and close. Friend or foe, if it moved inside the pattern, they opened fire. But Howard grasped something the doctrine writers had missed. The German head-on attack required a clear, open run. Fighters needed a straight line high speed and a clean field of fire that if a defending fighter planted itself directly in front of the bombers, between the attackers and their targets, the Germans faced two choices. Break off or risk a head-on collision with an armed opponent closing at over 600 miles per hour. Howard slipped his Mustang into the lead element of the bomber formation. He throttled back to hold their speed. He flew just ahead of the lead B-17, low and centered, his silhouette framed against the sky. The bomber crew spotted him. They had no idea what he intended. Some assumed he was disoriented. Others feared he'd been hit and was trying to stay close for rescue. A few gunners tracked him cautiously, fingers brushing their triggers, waiting to see if he was friend or threat. Then the Germans attacked again. .2 Messerschmitts diving from 11 o'clock high, nose on, cannons armed. They had a perfect setup. The bombers were fixed in formation, unable to maneuver. The geometry was ideal until Howard appeared. He held his line, waited until the final possible instant, fired a tight burst, and broke left. The lead German pilot flinched, rolled, and aborted the pass. The second fighter followed. Neither committed. The danger was too great. The Mustang was in the way, and it was shooting. Howard climbed, rolled, and slipped back into formation, though he tucked himself again into the lead element, just ahead and slightly below. The B-17 pilots adjusted their spacing. Now they understood. He wasn't confused. He was shielding them. The Germans regrouped. They tried beam attacks. Howard intercepted from the flank. They tried vertical dives. He climbed and forced overshoots. They tried coordinated attacks from multiple vectors. He pivoted, fired, and spoiled each one. The Luftwaffe didn't back down. They were experienced, aggressive, and determined, but they were also bound by physics and the limits of acceptable risk. Every pass Howard contested was a pass that failed, and every failure drained fuel, momentum, and confidence. The bomber gunners started working with him. They held their fire when he cut across their sights. They called out threats over the radio. They covered his blind spots today. An unwritten partnership formed. One Mustang and 30 bombers operating as a single defensive machine against an enemy that outnumbered them all. For half an hour, Howard fought alone. He burned through ammo. He burned through fuel. He took hits. Small caliber rounds punching holes through his fuselage, missing vital components by inches. His engine ran hot. His hands ached. His vision narrowed from adrenaline and oxygen strain. But the bombers stayed intact, and gradually the Germans began to peel away. The moment his fuel gauge dipped below reserve, the Luftwaffe pulled out. It wasn't a retreat, it was a calculation. The bombers were nearing the target's edge. Allied fighters would soon return. The risk-reward balance had shifted. German fighters broke away in pace, diving to lower altitude and fading into cloud. Howard watched them vanish. He didn't pursue. He had no fuel, no ammunition, and barely enough speed to remain airborne. He eased his Mustang out of the bomber box. The lead B-17 rocked its wings. A silent salute. Howard returned the gesture, leveled out, and began the long glide toward England. His engine coughed twice. Fuel starvation. He adjusted the mixture, leaned it as far as possible, and coaxed another 10 minutes of power from a nearly dry tank. The English shoreline emerged through the haze. He crossed at 2,000 feet, too low for comfort, too high to eject. He landed at the first airfield he could find. The Mustang rumbled to a stop. The engine died. Howard sat in the cockpit. Silent as ground crew rushed toward him. They found bullet holes in the wings, the tail, and the fuselage. They found an engine that had survived only on fumes and luck. They found a pilot who had gone deeper into enemy skies, stayed longer under fire, and engaged more fighters than any other escort mission on record. But they did not find a single mark on him. Howard climbed out, filed a short combat report, and spoke little. He noted the bombers, the Germans, and the maneuver. He did not exaggerate. He did not claim certainty. He simply described what occurred. The bomber crews told a very different story. When they returned to their bases in England, they met with intelligence officers and described the mission. They spoke of the lone Mustang that had remained with them for half an hour. They spoke of the pilot who had flown inside their formation, taken attacks aimed at them, and turned himself into a moving barrier against an entire German fighter group. The gunners estimated 14 separate enemy fighters engaged. Some claimed more. All agreed on one point. Without that pilot, they would not have returned home. The story spread quickly. Within days, it reached 8th Air Force headquarters. Commanders compared Howard's brief report with the bomber crew's accounts and studied the tactical effects. What Howard had done broke regulations. It was reckless on paper, but it had worked. And in a war where bomber losses were crushing morale and campaign strength, results mattered more than procedure. In April 1944, James Howard received the Medal of Honor. He was the only fighter pilot in the European theater to be awarded the nation's highest military decoration. The citation praised his bravery, his skill, and his dedication to the bomber crews he protected. But the citation did not mention the one thing that mattered most. Howard had not fought from impulse or blind courage. He had fought from logic. He had seen a problem, weighed the factors, and carried out a solution no manual had imagined. He had turned himself into a weapon not through firepower but through positioning. He realized that presence, not kills, was a real key to disruption. And by doing so, he exposed a weakness in German tactics that no one had recognized before. The head-on attack had been the Luftwaffe's most lethal method against American daylight bombers. It depended on speed, shock, and the bombers' limited forward guns. But it also depended on a psychological rule. Escorts stayed outside. Fighters guarded bombers from a distance. They did not block the attack path. Howard shattered that assumption. Within weeks, the 8th Air Force began training escort pilots in close-in defensive tactics. The goal was not to repeat Howard's solo stand, impossible and suicidal by nature, but to use parts of his positioning method in coordinated escort doctrine. Fighters began flying closer to the bombers. They placed themselves along the likely German attack routes. They did not wait for threats to form. They cut them off early. The simple presence of a fighter in the path of a head-on dive forced German pilots to hesitate, correct, or turn away. Loss rates started to drop. It was not instant. It was not the only cause. The arrival of long-range P-51 escorts, improved formations, and the shrinking pool of Luftwaffe veterans all played roles. But the change in escort positioning, the willingness to fly tighter, accept risk, and disrupt rather than merely intercept, became a lasting part of bomber defense for the rest of the war. Bomber crews noticed the change. They felt safer. They flew with more confidence. And they spoke of Howard's mission as proof that one pilot in the right place at the right time could shift the course of a battle. The Germans noticed as well. Intelligence reports from captured Luftwaffe pilots mentioned American fighters that refused to leave the bombers, that stayed tight even under fire, and that made coordinated attacks far more difficult. The tactic did not stop German interceptions, but it weakened their impact. And in a war of attrition, that was enough. Howard returned to duty. He flew more missions, trained new pilots, and continued sharpening his method. He was not inclined toward self-promotion. He did not seek interviews or attention. He flew, he fought, and he endured. By the war's end, he had been credited with 6 victories in the European theater in addition to his 6 with the Flying Tigers. His official total was modest beside some aces, but numbers alone did not reflect his influence. He showed that courage without logic was noise, and logic without courage was theory. Only together could they shape results. James Howard survived the conflict. He remained in the Air Force, advanced to Brigadier General, and retired in 1966 after nearly 3 decades of service. He lived quietly in Florida, far from the public eye, and seldom spoke about the mission that earned him the Medal of Honor. When asked in later years, he said only that he acted as the situation demanded. He did not call it heroism. He called it problem-solving. He saw bombers at risk, recognized a gap in their protection, and filled it. The fact that it succeeded, he said, owed as much to fortune as to skill. But those who flew with him disagreed. They saw a man who had trained himself to think under fire, to stay steady when chaos ruled, and to choose action when others might have frozen. They saw someone who understood that wars were not won by following every rule. They were won by knowing when to bend them. The maneuver he used that day, flying inside the bomber formation to break up head-on attacks, was never formally added to doctrine. It was too hazardous, too dependent on individual judgment, and too easy to misuse. But it survived in the oral traditions of fighter tactics. Instructors retold the story, pilots debated it, and in the decades ahead, versions of the idea appeared in air combat doctrine worldwide. Howard's legacy was not one technique. It was a mindset, the recognition that aerial combat was not defined by bravery alone, but by geometry, timing, and the willingness to hold the one position the enemy least expected. In the vast history of World War II aviation, his name appears less frequently than it deserves. He was not flamboyant. He did not accumulate a towering score. He did not match the stereotype of the swaggering ace. But the bomber crews who returned home on January 11, 1944, never forgot what he had done, and they carried that memory through the rest of their lives. Some named their sons after him. Some wrote to thank him decades later. Some simply repeated the story to anyone willing to listen. Because in a war that consumed millions, James Howard reminded them that one person in one moment could still shift balance. Not with overwhelming firepower, not with blind chance, but with a rare blend of clarity, courage, and refusal to accept that the impossible must remain impossible till he died in 1995 at the age of 81. His funeral was attended by veterans, fellow pilots, and men who had flown in bombers over Germany half a century earlier. They did not speak about tactics or doctrine. They spoke about the day a single Mustang remained when every practical reason urged it to leave. And they spoke about the lesson he left behind, that the most powerful weapon in war is not the machine, but the mind bold enough to use it differently.